pasó con Rada?
Oye, si ya estaba mandando a su casa.
Hace más de un año el mundo se paralizó, pero tú no. Tú descubriste nuevas aficiones. Quizás te animaste a emprender o conectaste con tu familia más que nunca. Con esa nueva mirada, redescubre tu comunidad. Vuelve a asombrarte con tus paisajes, con tu historia. Vuelve a tu ciudad del saber. Naturaleza, arquitectura, creatividad, ciencias, emprendimiento, cultura, negocios, sostenibilidad, innovación. Llénate de anécdotas y de nuevas experiencias. Ven a sentir y pensar en un nuevo comienzo. Ven a Ciudad del Saber. Descarga la audioguía en Easy Travel y realiza un recorrido con increíbles relatos de esta comunidad innovadora.
A pocos minutos del centro urbano de Panamá y frente al canal, 120 hectáreas y más de 200 edificios de la antigua base militar de Clayton han sido transformados para convertirse en Ciudad del Saber, una comunidad innovadora que impulsa el cambio social a través del humanismo, la ciencia y los negocios. Desde aquí, científicos, pensadores, artistas, así como gente del mundo de los negocios, expertos del gobierno, ONGs y organismos internacionales colaboran para generar soluciones a problemas locales y globales, teniendo como visión un futuro próspero, inclusivo, democrático y sostenible. Cuenta con una comunidad residente y da también la bienvenida a los visitantes. Ofrece una variada programación de actividades para el público pensada para compartir conocimiento, así como eventos culturales y comunitarios que enriquecen la experiencia de vida en el campus. Ciudad del Saber crea un entorno de bienestar para las personas y la comunidad. Promueve el urbanismo sostenible y la conservación del patrimonio histórico y quiere ser un laboratorio de innovación para Panamá y el mundo.
Buenos días, bienvenidos a Ciudad del Saber, tu comunidad innovadora que impulsa el cambio social a través del humanismo, la ciencia y los negocios. Hoy, en nuestro webinar, tendremos un importante invitado, el Dr. John Bellamy Foster. Este espacio, que es generado un martes al mes, es producto de la iniciativa del doctor Guillermo Castro, quien nos acompaña, para dar a conocer sobre diferentes temas e invitando a académicos relevantes que nos brindan conocimiento y nos permiten llevar a cabo un intercambio y un diálogo. En esta ocasión nos acompaña también nuestro presidente ejecutivo, el profesor Jorge Arosemena, quien también nos dará unas palabras al final de esta sesión. So now we're going to move to English. We welcome you to City of Knowledge, your innovative community that welcomes all to the exchange of knowledge and for exchange of ideas. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. John Bellamy Foster, who's professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Dr. Foster will speak about Marxism and ecological revolution. We would like to remind everyone that on the right side of your screen, you will find a chat channel where you can leave questions, comments, and ideas. Before we start, I would like to share a brief biography of Dr. Foster. Professor Foster received his PhD from New York University. His research is devoted to critical inquiries into theory and history, focusing primarily on the economic, ecological contradictions of capitalism and imperialism, but also encompassing the broader realm of social theory as a whole. Professor Foster's teaching encourages critical and in-depth exploration of history and ideology, equipping students to learn for themselves. John Bellamy Foster is editor of Monthly Review, New York, and Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Oregon. He's the author of many books, including Marxism, Ecology, 2000, The Return of Nature, 2000, and Capitalism and the Anthropocene, 2022. With no further ado, I leave you with Dr. Guillermo Castro and Dr. John Bellamy Foster. Welcome to the space Saber de la Ciudad.
Muy buenos días. I will try to myself understood in English. We are very pleased to have John Bellamy Foster with us. As many of you know, he's a well-known author on the history of the role of environmental ideas in Marxism and the influence of Marxism in contemporary debates about the current environmental crisis. His book, La Ecología de Marx, has played an important role in this debate in the Spanish-speaking world. And we hope that his most recent book, The Return of Nature, will do the same when translated. Of particular importance in Professor Bellamy's work is the position he has developed on the role played by the metabolical rift between nature and society in the origin and development of a crisis that started as environmental, has come at civilizatory level, so to say, has become produced really a turning point in the history of human development. We have asked him to speak freely about his work and to present us in Panama and in Latin America. We have several people from other countries linked to this lecture, and to present us his ideas on this metabolical rift. In our times, in our current times, when we have seen how it's very probably that neither the climate change agreements or the Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved in the dates originally planned. Please, John Bellamy, feel welcome, and it's your lecture now.
Thank you. I'm going to speak on Marxism and ecological revolution. And the 20th century has seen a revolution in Marxian ecological thought that's extended across the globe. An indication of this is that half of the winners of the prestigious Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize, the leading prize in Marxian thought in Europe and North America in the last half dozen years, were works directly associated with the elaboration of Marx's theory of metabolic rift. And this is due to Marxism's growing theoretical and practical importance in an age of ecological catastrophe and, we hope, ecological revolution. In what follows, I will give a short historical sketch of these theoretical developments and some of the major concepts that have emerged. But I want to emphasize that the growing influence of Marxian ecology has to do with two things. One is that only this approach, only the approach to ecological issues arising out of classical historical materialism has been able to bring together the social critique and the ecological critique in a unified way. There really is no comparison anywhere else in ecological thought. And at the same time, the Marxian ecological critique has been able to bring together social science, the social scientific approach to ecology, and the natural scientific approach. So it's this unified critical perspective that's so powerful today. We live in a period of planetary emergency, or planetary ecological crisis, and we sometimes explain that in terms of the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch of the Anthropocene proposed by science, which really is based on the thesis that anthropogenic factors or anthropogenic causes are now the determinant force in Earth system change, as opposed to non-anthropogenic factors in all of previous Earth history. And we are in a period where, because of anthropogenic factors, that is human-induced environmental change in the Earth system as a whole, that we are undermining the basis of a life on the planet, particularly the basis of human civilization and the human species. We're crossing critical planetary thresholds that are necessary for our own existence. So this is the period in which we live. And the Anthropocene can be said, in the sciences say, the Anthropocene really began in the 1950s. And probably the best marker of this is the Castle Bravo thermonuclear test in 1954, where they accidentally increased, the United States accidentally produced a nuclear explosion that was 2.5 times what was predicted and 1,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. And it spread radiation throughout the globe. And this is when scientists began to organize in a unified way over environmental issues, dealing with the problem of above ground nuclear testing and radiation and bio accumulation and biomagnification of radioactive nuclides in the environment. And out of that arose all of the other environmental struggles, marked especially by the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. And while this was going on, Marxian ecology, socialist ecology was developing as well. In fact, the scientists and activists who initially organized over the nuclear testing were all from the socialist tradition and entered the environmental struggle in that way from socialist or left traditions. And so in the period from, say, about the 1950s to the 1970s, when ecological analysis was developing, there was a very close association of socialist ecology, and which went way back, in fact, and the environmental movement itself. But in the 1980s, or late 1970s and 1980s, some of this became formalized within socialist thought. And we had the rise of what we call eco-socialism in the work of people like Andre Gortz, Ted Benton in England, James O'Connor in the United States. And these thinkers all came out of the Marxist tradition in some way or other, and they however, were moving away from Marxism in certain in certain respects. So in the late 1970s up through the early 1990s, you had the development of an eco-socialism that was very critical of Marx and Engels, and both classical Marxism and of Marxism in general. And they basically held on to the conceptions on labor, but for a thinker like Ted Benton, they said, well, Marx was wrong on natural limits, and that Malthus was on track and not Marx. So it became a very the eco-socialism tradition emerged in Europe and North America as partly critical of Marxism, and this generated a debate. And by the late 1990s, researchers started to look, well, what did classical Marxism have to offer on the environment? And the explorations into the original texts and reevaluating, reconstructing Marxist theory in this respect. And it was discovered by myself and others that Marx's classical historical materialism had a very powerful ecological critique, unlike any other that existed. We usually call this the theory of metabolic rift. And we discovered also that this tradition carried forward and also through the notion of the dialectics of nature, influenced the development of ecological thought all the way through, that socialists played the formative role in the development of ecological thought in general, particularly with respect to the sciences. And so this debate took the form of a controversy between what we call first stage eco-socialists, who basically tried to graft green theory, some of it's Malthusian, some of it primarily simply ethical, but graft green theory onto Marxism, or to graft Marxism onto green theory, creating a kind of hybrid. And that was the form that first stage eco-socialism took. But by the late 1990s and throughout this century so far, the dominant tradition, which has expanded around the world, has been focused on reconstructing the classical Marxist critique of ecology and the various contributions to that as a way of getting at the fundamental ecological problem. And the beauty of this, of course, is that in Marx's critique, as I said in the beginning, the social critique and the ecological critique are completely unified, basically two sides of the same coin. And the same with social science and natural science within this perspective. So the understanding is, and this involved basically going back and re-examining Marx's materialism and understanding how an ecological materialism arose in Marx's thought, going all the way back to his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and the philosophy of nature. The understanding now is that Marx's materialist conception of history, which was his main contribution, was based on a foundation of the materialist conception of nature generated by natural science. So he took the materialist conception of nature as his foundation, and always referred to that, always connected his materialist conception of history to that, but made his own distinctive contributions. That is, the result of that is that Materialism in Marx is not simply economic, as was widely thought, but it's a deeper materialism that has to do with our entire relation to the earth. So with the reemergence of Marx's ecology in the early 2000s, we have a reinterpretation of Marx's value theory in terms of ecological value form analysis, not questioning the value theory, but bringing in the importance of ecological conceptions in that value theory. So Marx explained that with respect to wealth, labor is not the only source of wealth, and nature is as well. In fact, nature is the most fundamental source of wealth. And he insisted on this again and again. Marx's notion of natural material use values has to be understood in relation to exchange value. We have to understand the ecological basis of use values. So there was an analysis of Marx's ecological value analysis. We also increasingly explored ecological materialism in these terms, how a deeper sense of materialism pervades all of Marx's thought. And the largest focus has been on the metabolic rift theory. And if I can't go into that in great detail, but I'll try and give you an idea. The concept of metabolism emerged in science, mainly in Germany in the early 19th century, the very early 19th century, originally from the work of cell biologists. It quickly got integrated with the developing analysis of thermodynamics, particularly the analysis of the first law of thermodynamics. And so the analysis of energy and metabolism went hand in hand. And there was the emergence of out of this, a kind of a systematic ecological perspective. Really, the most important thinker, I think, in terms of developing a systems ecology in the beginning was the Marxist theorist, physician, scientist, and political activist Roland Daniels, who was arrested in the Cologne communist trials and died at a very early age as a result of, I think it was tuberculosis, possibly pneumonia that he contracted while he was in prison. Marx dedicated his critique of Proudhon to the poverty of philosophy to Roland Daniels. But Roland Daniels wrote a book called Microcosmos, in which he used the concept of metabolism to connect animal life and plant life and show the integration of them. But he had only one reader, and that was Karl Marx, because the book wasn't ever published and Daniels died. And but he'd given the manuscript to Marx to read and comment on. And Marx, after this, took up the concept of metabolism and used it beginning in the 1850s, or late 1840s, 1850s in all of his work, and it became the basis of ecological perspective. Marx introduced the concept of social metabolism, and in this he was partly influenced by the German chemist, and particularly agricultural chemist Justus von Liebig, who had used metabolism in his work and was dealing with the loss of soil fertility due to the loss of soil nutrients, and Liebig used the notion of metabolism, but Marx introduced the notion of social metabolism, and this was significant. Marx also introduced another concept called the universal metabolism of nature. He basically argued that nature was a universal metabolism, so you could look at it in systemic terms. And we were part of, human beings were part of that universal metabolism, basically an emergent part. And in terms of social metabolism, Marx saw that as the labor and production process. So as human beings carried out production, or labor and production, they transformed nature and transformed their relation to nature. This is something that Marx discussed as early as his economic and philosophical manuscripts. But human beings transform nature, and they transform their own relation to nature and themselves. And the social metabolism constituted, the social metabolism or production constituted the human relation to nature fundamentally. Now, Marx also was dealing with the ecological crisis of his time, in Capital in particular. Liebig had and many others had focused on how soil nutrients were being lost as a result of industrialization. And basically, with the growth of industrial agriculture and industrialization in general, you had a situation where the populations were concentrated in the growing urban and manufacturing centers, and food and fiber was shipped to these urban centers, hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. And with the food and fiber went the soil nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and others. And so these soil nutrients ended up polluting the waterways, polluting the cities, and the nutrients did not return to the soil. So there was a great loss of fertility. There's a soil crisis, and the result was that the British and everyone else really in the industrial world started importing guano from Peru, to fertilize English and European and North American fields. To do this, they basically semi-enslaved Chinese workers to dig the guano in Peru. So this was going on. They had to go all across the globe to get guano to try to replace the nutrients in the soil. They robbed the catacombs and the Napoleonic battlefields, the catacombs of Europe and the Napoleonic battlefields for bones to put on English soil, and this was going on, and they started to develop synthetic fertilizers. But Marx, analyzing this, analyzed it as basically a robbing of the soil and an undermining of the metabolism between human beings and the earth. And so he talked about the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, the creation of a rift in the human relation to the earth as a result of an alienated social metabolism, which was ecologically destructive. And he said that this was inherent in capitalism, and the earth had to be restored. And he applied this to other areas of ecological existence, ecological crises as well. Well, we can understand it by saying that the social metabolism, the alienated social metabolism under capitalism came in conflict with the universal metabolism of nature, as Marx called it, creating a rift or metabolic rift in the relation between human beings and the environment. And this became the basis of a whole lot of ecological explorations in Marx and also in later thinkers. It also came to be connected to Engels's dialectics of nature, and a lot of this fed into the development of ecological theory. The most important ecologists in England, for example, came out of this basic tradition. E. Ray Lankester, who was the leading biologist in England in the generation after Darwin and Huxley, he was their protege, was also a close friend of Karl Marx, and he became the leading ecological critic in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. And his student, Arthur Tansley, the Lancaster was a sort of Fabian socialist who'd read Marx's Capital. Tansley was Lancaster's student, a plant ecologist who was also a Fabian-style socialist, but synthesized his work with Marxian science at the time, like the work of the mathematician Hyman Levy, and Tansley came up with the concept of ecosystem, which really had the metabolism as its basis. And all of our systems ecology comes out of that. The whole notion of the Earth system today comes out of that. We talk about the metabolism of the Earth system. All of this is part of a tradition that in the development of science and in the development of the socialist critique that was very closely interlocked. So we have developed analyses now of the 21st century ecological crisis. There are influential analyses of a climate change problem, of the carbon metabolism, how basically the carbon metabolism represents a rift in the Earth system, and how this developed and how this was integrated with capitalism. And these analyses are integrated with both social science and natural science. And the analysis has also led to a discussion of the relationship between what we call the robbery and the rift. Marx talked about the ecological problem as basically arising from the robbery of nature, or the robbery of the earth, in the sense that there's no equal exchange. There's no exchange of equivalence or reciprocity in the relation to nature, that it's basically expropriated under capitalism without being restored, without reproduction, without concern for sustainability. And this is quite essential. Marx himself developed the most radical concept of sustainability that we have ever seen. He wrote, from the standpoint of a higher socioeconomic formation, he meant socialism, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as absurd as the private property of one man in other men, that is, slavery. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations as bona patris familias, good heads of the household. Marx talked about the need to sustain the natural world for the chain of human generations. And he explained how the capitalist system, by its very nature, was destructive of all of that. So this has created a revolution in Marxian ecological thought. The notion of the dialectics of nature, which was sort of thrown out in Western philosophy, I mean in the Western Marxist tradition in philosophy, very particular tradition that arose in the 1920s, that basically said that the dialectics does not apply to nature. That was inspired by George Lukács's view in History and Class Consciousness, although Lukács was actually much more complex in this respect and didn't deny the dialectics of nature. But all other Western Marxist thinkers did. It became the definition of Western Marxism that essentially that the dialectics of nature only applied to society and history and not to natural relations, with the result that natural history, nature, and science basically got thrown out of Marxist, Western Marxist analysis and ended up being seen as positivistic and mechanistic and not something that Marxists would have anything to do with. So Marxism academically came to be relegated for a time to just history, social science, the humanities, but not natural science. And yet there was always a second foundation of Marxism within natural science that evolved in the way that I suggested, and that developed up until the environmental movement of the 1960s and played a very important role. But for most Marxist intellectuals, Marxism had abandoned the materialist conception of nature, the dialectics of nature. And with the development of Marxian ecological thought, this has been reversed, so that there is now a reappropriation and analysis of the dialectics of nature. This also has inspired theories of ecological imperialism, theories of unequal ecological exchange that have been developed in Marxist analysis and studying all kinds of forms of unequal ecological exchange. And the most famous, the most important studies are really based on the Peruvian guano trade as a model of ecological imperialism. But the analysis really is developed everywhere in terms of societies all over the world, how the global south was robbed of its resources. We also see the development of Marxian ecology as integrated with feminist social reproduction theory and theories of racial capitalism, because they all increasingly focus on Marx's concept of expropriation or a robbery, that is basically exchange without reciprocity, appropriation without an equivalent. Appropriation without equivalent, without reciprocity, is really robbery for Marx. And we found that the capitalist relation of nature really takes the form of expropriation, but we also need the concept of expropriation to understand, let's say, the destruction of the commons, the enclosure of the commons, the expropriation of women's domestic labor and the labor of subsistence workers without any kind of equivalent, and we understand increasingly the whole development of the slave trade and racism as a case of expropriation of human bodies. So the concept of corporeal rift, or the rift the metabolic rift as it applies to human bodies and the destruction of human beings themselves physically, has been introduced, and there is more and more analysis of that. In terms of ecological revolution, it's understood that given our ecological crisis, even the IPCC has now said this in its latest report on mitigation. It's understood that we need revolutionary scale change and transformation of social institutions, simply because of climate change, not even including all of the other planetary boundaries. So we need an ecological revolution that dwarfs all social revolutions previously, and it necessarily has to involve social transformation. And in metabolic rift theory, we often think in terms of Istvan Mesros's Beyond Capital and his other works, where he dealt with the concept of social metabolic reproduction and the creation of a more unified social metabolic system of reproduction that breaks with capitalism and provides a sustainable form of sustainable human development that conforms to classical Marxism. Well, I often say that today socialism comes down to two concepts: substantive equality and ecological sustainability. We need those two things, and all of our other struggles are melded with that. We also have been talking about the question of an environmental proletariat, which is a complex idea, but actually goes back to classical Marxism, and we could say to Engels's The Condition of the Working Class in England, where it was understood that the proletariat was engaged in material struggles that were not simply about economics in the sense of fighting for wages and decent conditions in factories, but they were also struggling for clean water, for nutritious and adequate food, for clean air, they were struggling against disease, which was imposed through social institutions, primarily, affected the poor. The epidemics of the time fell hardest on the poor, and all of these things had an epidemiological and ecological as well as economic basis. And the struggle was very unified in that respect. And what we're seeing today is the growth of environmental proletariat, which could also encompass the notion of an ecological peasantry, in which people are basically dispossessed, placed in a proletarian position, not simply on an economic basis, but also on an ecological basis. And increasingly, people are fighting the battle on both fronts, to the point that when you're short of food today, when there's a food crisis, it's equally an environmental and an economic problem, and it has to be then seen in these terms. So a broader notion of the proletariat that's actually being forced on us, and that we're seeing manifest itself because we're seeing an age where hundreds of millions of people are entering into the struggle for the earth, for their material conditions, both ecological and economic. And it will be billions of people. We don't know if they'll win. We don't know if the human population and the underprivileged will win, but we know the struggle is developing, and is becoming more and more important. Another area in which ecological Marxism has developed is degrowth theory has been very important, although it has its problems in terms of challenging the GDP as a sole indicator of human welfare, and in raising issues like low energy solutions and so on. And recently there's been developing out of ecological Marxism, out of Marxian ecology and eco-socialism, an eco-socialist approach to degrowth that focuses on the social relations, which is very important. Ecological Marxism has taken off in China and played a very big role. These ideas are very influential now in China and have merged with Chinese tradition in Marxism. The Chinese have developed the notion of ecological civilization, which they took over from Soviet environmentalists and scientists of the 1980s, and had developed the notion of ecological civilization, and the Chinese have developed that and are trying to implement that and are adopting many of these notions of ecological Marxism, not without contradictions, of course. And so we're seeing a great world struggle. But one of the things that's made this so important is the concept of metabolic rift, which gives us an understanding of ecological contradictions, how they're tied to capitalism, allow us to tie in with the science, the natural science itself. So this work crosses between the social sciences and natural sciences with publications on both sides. I think this is a revolutionary development. It offers hope. It's influenced movements like the MST in Brazil and La Campesina and other movements. And it really gives us a basis in which to struggle, which most ecological theories don't. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bellamy. We have here questions from Elpidio Gonzalez. He says, thank you for this wonderful conference. You mentioned the vision that Marx had about nature as a producer of wealth. I see the property of means of production by workers, as Marx proposed, as an ethical and economical solution that comes after the fact that workers are the owners of their labor. However, when we think about who are the owners of the goods and services provided solely by nature, what criteria should guide our relationship with nature, considering the damage that private state property of nature attributes have done? What questions should we ask ourselves about this issue?
Well, one thing that I didn't explain very well is, you know, the labor theory of value argues, and it's very powerful in terms of the ecological question, because the labor theory of value says value under capitalism is generated by labor and solely by labor. But Marx didn't invent the labor theory of value. It really came out of classical political economy in general, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and so on. And it really reflects the institutional character of capital, so that for capital, only labor creates value. Even in neoclassical economics, they say, well, labor and human services, and they count capital as the role of capital as a human service. Only those things create value. But nature doesn't have a part in value, and value is our only criteria, so that everything that nature provides was classified in classical political economy quite accurately in terms of how capitalism works. And still in neoclassical economics, what nature provides is a free gift. And from that, because of that, that encourages a kind of robbery of nature, an expropriation of nature, an approach that sees nature as an externality, something to be dumped on or wasted. Well, but Marx's approach made a distinction between value and wealth. In modern economics, they don't. In neoclassical economics, they don't. In bourgeois economics. But Marx, like other classical economists, made a distinction between value and wealth. And he basically argued that it's true that in capitalism, only labor creates value. But the broader perspective has to be the perspective of wealth. And nature is the fundamental creator of wealth, of which labor is only a secondary aspect. So both nature and labor create wealth, but since labor is really part of nature, in Marx's view, it all has a natural basis. And we look at wealth in terms of use values. We look at value in terms of exchange values, and exchange values are all that matter for capitalism. But to focus on wealth means that you have to focus on natural material use values, that is the earth itself and the ecological basis of our existence. And this is very much part of Marx's own analysis. And we have to maintain and restore that. It has to be treated on a sustainable basis for what he called the chain of human generations. So we can't approach nature simply on an economic basis, certainly not on a capitalist economic basis, which is geared to expropriation, extractivism, and so on. We have to approach it in terms of, we can't approach it in terms of value. We have to approach it in terms of wealth. We can't reduce it to economics. We also have to bring in science in the broader sense, representing a larger set of values, including conservation and so on. So the problem is the narrow reductionist economic expropriation of the earth, and we have to combat that. I hope that helps answer that question.
Yes, thank you. We have one last question because we are running out of time from Franklin Bianco. He asked, which authors will help us to understand more about Marxian ecology?
Which authors? Well, on terms of the value theory, I would recommend Paul Burkett, Marx and Nature, and his other works. On fossil capitalism, the whole problem of fossil fuels historically and its relation to capitalism, I'd recommend the work of Andreas Malm. On Karl Marx's own ecological materialism, there's my work, and there's also Kohei Saito's Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which has extended the analysis into Marx's notebooks in terms of relating this to issues like race and settler colonialism. I recommend the work of Hannah Holloman. There are many, many thinkers in this. In terms of the climate change problem, in terms of the Anthropocene, I particularly recommend the work of Ian Angus. And then there's Brett Clark and Richard York have done phenomenal work in various areas. So there is there are actually thousands of works and that are out now. We've got a bibliography on the monthly review site on the metabolic rift where we've listed some things that you can go to in the hundreds, but you know, there's thousands of works on this.
Okay. I think Jorge, our president, has a meeting in a few moments, more than minutes, but I would like to join Elpidio in thanking Professor Foster for his lecture. I have only one commentary about the capacity for the Marxian perspective to integrate different approaches. This Räuberschaft or robbery economy was not by itself a concept, as long as I know, a concept produced by Marxism, but it came from a French geographer in the late 19th, early 20th century, whose name I do not remember in this moment. The important thing is the neat way which it can obtain a full sense in a Marxian perspective. This real historical sense of Räuberschaft, of course, has to do with the development of the first world market in the history of mankind, and the organization of this market in several different world systems a long time. But it is a concept of particular importance in Latin America in this moment. When you look, for instance, at what Professor Foster said about guano, what has to do with oil in countries like Venezuela and Mexico, what it has to do with open mining for metallic minerals, like it's going on in Panama right now, or in Peru and Chile for a very long time, or what is going on now in the conflicts around lithium for the production of electric batteries. So all of these, in my opinion, led us to something we have discussed before. We have said before, if we want a different environment, we will need to create a different society. The process of social transformation is already going on in the framework of this crisis. If we can conduct that process, it could be for better. If we leave it to this point, what some people call the spontaneous demands of market, etc., it could be for the worst. It's a choice, and we need to understand it in order to take position, so to say, in the face of it. And now I'm asking Professor Arosemena for please saying the final words in this edition of the Knowledge of the City.
Well, first of all, Dr. Foster, I want to thank you very much for your lecture. Myself, I've been taking a lot of notes. You have introduced a number of concepts that are really, to me, showing the complexity of the challenge we have before us, but basically the values by which we are in this planet, and how we appreciate and value the meaning of nature and our relationship, us human beings with nature. I am very sorry and I apologize, but I should have been already downstairs presiding an event that is very important for Panama that has to do with a general consultation conducted last year with the general public on how we bring back these proposals, and we're trying to solidify that. And science, we have been promoting, of course, at City of Knowledge, and the movement that we have accompanied from the early times called Science in Panama, they are adhering to this national pact, and I must preside that meeting, which is already beginning downstairs. I hope we have another opportunity to further discuss so many interesting. I took notes of so many concepts you brought to the table. So thanks a lot, and I dismiss myself and apologize for doing that. Thank you again, and we certainly hope to have you here in Panama at City of Knowledge, or at least exchange this way in the near future. So thanks a lot again, Dr. Foster.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much again. Do you want to say anything in addition?
I did go over a lot of concepts in history, and I'm sure that some of it just floated by, but I did hope that those of you who are part of this got excited and interested and recognize from this the richness of the critical analysis that is being carried out, and begin to explore it yourselves. And so in a way, I wanted to inspire you to investigate this frame of critical analysis, which is not the solution to everything, but it's in many ways captures the core of the problems that we face today, including the problem of ecological revolution, something that we need.
Thank you very much. And as Jorge said, we really hope to see you again at the City of Knowledge.
Thank you.